It all began on one of those mornings that should have been peaceful, kind where the sun filters through the leaves with a golden warmth and the air smells faintly of wet soil. But instead of basking in my little oasis, I was yanked into a war I never wanted with an HOA that had somehow convinced itself that my front yard, with its neat rows of herbs, colorful blooms, and carefully arranged vegetable patches, was a crime against the neighborhood aesthetic. I had poured years of love, money, sweat, and more weekends than I could count into building a garden that wasn't just decorative but practical: 2 tomatoes, peppers, lavender, sunflowers, tall enough to look like watchtowers guarding my home, and neighbors often stopped on their walks to admire it, compliment me, or even ask for cuttings and seeds. But apparently the HOA board didn't see charm in any of it, because one Tuesday I opened my mailbox to find a stark white envelope stamped with their seal, and inside a letter written in stiff legal language, accusing me of violating landscape uniformity standards and demanding that I restore my yard to its original state, which essentially meant flattening my garden into lifeless grass. At first I laughed because I thought it was a mistake, some automated notice that wasn't meant for me. But the following week, another letter came, this one marked as a final warning. And when I read the part about daily fines accumulating if I didn't comply, my laugh turned into a knot of frustration in my chest, because it wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about someone deciding that my effort, my identity, and the little slice of happiness I had cultivated with my own 2 hands were nothing but weeds to be destroyed. And I couldn't help but picture those board members sitting in their sterile offices, sipping coffee and congratulating themselves for keeping the neighborhood uniform. While I sat on my porch staring at the flowers swaying in the breeze, wondering how people could look at life and insist on cutting it down, I tried reasoning first, calling the HOA office, only to be placed on hold for 20 minutes and then brushed off by a secretary who promised someone would look into it but never called back. And when I showed up in person at the next board meeting, armed with photos of neighbors admiring my garden and a petition signed by several supportive families on my street, I was met with condescending smirks and an HOA president named Carol Perfectly, coiffed, draped in pastel, and radiating that smug aura of someone who lived for rules and petty power, who tapped her pen on the table and told me my yard was an eyesore that degraded property values. That last part stung. So I had seen how the neighborhood had responded to my garden. It was a gathering spot, a conversation starter, even a teaching space for kids who wanted to learn about planting. And yet here was Carol, backed by her cronies, reducing all of it to a dollar sign and a problem to be erased. And as I stood there listening to their self-righteous lectures about community standards, I realized they didn't just want conformity, they thrived on control, and my defiance was an inconvenience that threatened the little empire of authority they had built on the backs of homeowners too tired or intimidated to fight back. I left that meeting with my jaw tight and my fists clenched, promising myself I would not give them the satisfaction of tearing out a single route. But things only escalated from there, because the HOA began a campaign of harassment designed to break me down. Letters became daily. Fines started appearing in my account ledger. I even caught one of their so-called compliance officers standing on my lawn taking photos like some kind of paparazzi for dead plants. And when I confronted him, he muttered something about documenting violations before scurrying away. But the damage was done, because word spread that the HOA was cracking down, and soon I felt eyes on me whenever I tended to my plants. Like the neighborhood itself was divided between those who silently rooted for me and those who feared crossing the board. My friends urged me to lawyer up, but I knew that legal battles could drag on for months and cost me thousands. So instead I dove into research, combing through every clause of the HOA bylaws, every city ordinance, and every state law I could access online, looking for loopholes, protections, anything that would shield me from their tyranny. And what I found lit a spark of hope. There were protections for sustainable landscapes, exemptions for pollinator gardens, and even clauses about homeowners. Rights to grow food on their own property, which meant that if I could prove my garden fit those categories, the HOA's threats would crumble like a sandcastle against a rising tide. Meanwhile, I doubled down on my garden itself, turning it from a simple patchwork of plants into a living masterpiece designed. It's not just to grow, but to prove a point, added trellises with climbing beans, carved out walkways lined with marigolds, and installed small signs explaining the purpose of each plant. From the way lavender repelled pests to how milkweed supported monarch butterflies, and soon my yard wasn't just a personal haven, it was an educational exhibit, a statement that screamed resilience in the face of bureaucratic nonsense. And when neighbors came by to admire it, I quietly told them what the HOA was trying to do, and their indignation fueled mine. Suddenly, it wasn't just my fight. It was a community fight against an overreaching board that seemed to care more about sameness than sanity. But the HOA, true to form, didn't back down. They doubled their efforts, sending me threats about liens on my property if I didn't pay the mounting fines. And Carol herself showed up one morning while I was pruning basil, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and that smirk plastered on her face as she announced, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, that one way or another this little jungle will be gone by summer. And something inside me snapped, because I realized she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was enjoying the intimidation, relishing the power trip of making me squirm. And that was the moment I decided that if they wanted a war, they were going to get one, but not the kind they expected, because I wasn't about to yell or vandalize or stoop to their level. Instead, I was going to outsmart them, expose their hypocrisy, and use every tool at my disposal to make them regret ever thinking they could bully me into submission. And so that night, under the glow of a porch light and the hum of cicadas, I sat down with a notebook, a pile of HOA documents, and a plan beginning to form in my mind, a plan that would take patience, creativity, and more than a little bit of cunning, but one that promised a resolution so satisfying it made the weeks of frustration suddenly feel worth it. Because I was done being the victim of their petty empire and ready to become the gardener who turned the tables on them root by root, leaf by leaf, until the HOA's own arrogance became the weed that choked them. As the days stretched into weeks, my resolve hardened, and I began to implement the first phase of my plan with a precision that made even the most meticulous gardeners gasp. Because I wasn't just going to defend my garden, I was going to turn it into a fortress of legality, creativity, and psychological advantage. Starting with the research I had compiled that proved beyond doubt that my lush, thriving sanctuary fell squarely under the protections for sustainable and pollinator-friendly landscapes, and armed with photocopies, city codes, and articles from environmental websites, I drafted a detailed letter responding to every threat the HOA had sent. Each paragraph meticulously citing laws and ordinances, including footnotes and official references, so that even the most arrogant board member would find it impossible to dismiss without looking utterly foolish. And when I mailed it, I made sure to send it via certified mail with delivery confirmation, because every signature, every receipt, was another layer of armor against their bullying. And within days, I noticed subtle changes in their behavior: hesitant calls, awkward pauses at board meetings. But the real fun began when I leveraged the garden itself as a weapon of persuasion, installing solar-powered lights along the paths that illuminated the foliage at night in soft, ethereal colors, creating a visual spectacle that made casual strollers stop in awe, and adding a small motion-activated camera in one corner, disguised as a garden gnome, so I could document any unauthorized inspections or trespassing by the HOA agents, which I knew would be invaluable if they tried to escalate further. And the neighbors, sensing my shift from passive compliance to assertive resistance, started to rally around me, offering to testify, sign petitions, and even help with manual labor in the garden, which transformed my backyard into a hive of activity, creativity, and solidarity that the HOA couldn't ignore without risking public embarrassment. And speaking of public, I began sharing discreet updates with my local community newsletter, highlighting sustainable gardening, pollinator support, and home beautification, framing my garden not as an act of defiance, but as a contribution to the neighborhood's quality of life. And though I took care to avoid direct attacks on the board, the subtle implication that they were obstructing community improvement did not go unnoticed. Because social pressure has a way of gnawing at those perched atop imaginary thrones. And sure enough, Carol began showing signs of unease. A slight quiver in her otherwise practiced composure during meetings, a forced smile when she passed me. On the street, while I maintained a serene expression, walking past with pruning shears in hand, occasionally pausing to show the neighbors a particularly healthy sprout, or a sign explaining how the native plants supported bees and butterflies, which turned casual observers into allies, and as the board tried to convene in private, I found ways to attend meetings legally, armed with notes, questions, and evidence that made every complaint they had about my yard crumble under scrutiny. So when they tried to argue that certain sections were messy or inconsistent, I countered with documentation about the ecological benefits of plant diversity, soil health, and the importance of layered vegetation, all backed by expert citations, and I could see the room shift as tension rose. Because board members who were used to unquestioned authority suddenly realized that they were facing someone who was unflinching, prepared, and supported by both law and community sentiment. And the psychological effect was palpable as I continued to subtly expand my garden into spaces that had previously been empty or underutilized, planting hedgerows and flowering borders in patterns that were both aesthetically pleasing and legally protected, adding compost bins and rainwater collection systems that adhered to city guidelines, and turning the yard into an example of what a homeowner could achieve if given the freedom to garden without intimidation. And I didn't stop at passive resistance. I began documenting the HOA's inconsistencies and contradictions, keeping track of instances where they approved other yards with non-conforming elements while singling out mine, creating a dossier that could, if necessary, be presented to higher authorities or even the press. And as I built this arsenal of evidence, my creativity flourished. I sculpted topiary shapes that resembled humorous caricatures of the board members themselves, subtle enough to avoid legal trouble, but blatant enough to make visiting officials blush, and installed whimsical signs with quotes about independence, resilience, and the joy of gardening, which neighbors photographed and shared online, creating a quiet viral sensation that made the HOA look increasingly petty. And while all this was happening, I began forming alliances with local gardening clubs and environmental organizations, inviting them over for small workshops and garden appreciation. Days further cementing the narrative that my yard was a community asset, not a liability, and each time the HOA tried to send a notice or threaten a fine, I responded with evidence, questions, and courteous yet firm explanations that slowly eroded their credibility. And as months went by, I noticed the fines mysteriously vanishing from my ledger, letters arriving less frequently, and Carol's emails becoming increasingly curt, defensive, and sometimes contradictory, which meant my strategy was working, because the board was being forced to confront the fact that their attempts at intimidation were not only ineffective but also potentially illegal. And they were aware that any misstep could escalate into public scrutiny, legal consequences, or community backlash, which gave me a sense of quiet satisfaction that went beyond personal triumph. But the real turning point came when I decided to host an open garden event, inviting not just neighbors, but local media, gardening experts, and city officials, framing it as a celebration of sustainable landscaping and community engagement. And on the day of the event, my yard was transformed into a living mosaic of color, life, and ingenuity. Trellises and arches formed tunnels for climbing vegetables. Flower beds were arranged in harmonious patterns, pollinator stations dotted. The periphery and signage educated attendees on every aspect of the ecosystem I had nurtured, from soil health to butterfly conservation. And as the cameras clicked and officials took notes, I noticed Carol and a few board members lingering awkwardly at the edge, unsure how to react, because suddenly their warnings, their letters, and their threats seemed petty, irrelevant, and even absurd in the face of a vibrant community celebration that highlighted everything they claimed to value. And as neighbors mingled, sharing stories of how my garden had inspired them, taken them out of their own backyard monotony, or taught their children about nature, I realized that the momentum had shifted entirely, and with it, my confidence soared, because the HOA no longer held the power they had assumed they did, and I had done it without a single act of vandalism. Without raising my voice, but through strategy, creativity, persistence, and the undeniable power of a garden cultivated with love and patience. And from that day forward, Every attempt by the HOA to intimidate me was met with polite resistance. Documented evidence, and a visible network of supporters who could attest to the value and legality of my garden. And as weeks turned into months, the tension that had once dominated my life began to dissipate, replaced by quiet triumph. As Carol's emails became defensive inquiries, board meetings grew shorter and more cautious when my presence was noted. And the story of the homeowner who refused to bow to petty authority began to spread quietly across the neighborhood, earning me respect and admiration I had never anticipated. And through it all, my garden continued to thrive, not just as a collection of plants, but as a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the satisfaction of outsmarting those who underestimate the power of a determined, creative, and principled individual. And even now, as I water the sunflowers that have grown taller than the fence, prune the tomato vines that once were threatened with eradication, and watch the bees buzz happily from blossom to blossom, I feel an unspoken triumph radiating from every leaf, every bloom, every carefully nurtured corner of my oasis. Because the battle that began with fear, intimidation, and threats has evolved into a story of empowerment. Proof that intelligence, patience, and community support can topple even the most stubborn and overreaching authorities. And as I stand there, bathed in sunlight and listening to the gentle rustle of leaves, I know that the HOA has learned a lesson they will not soon forget, that a garden grown with heart, backed by law and community, cannot be threatened into submission, and in their attempts to assert control, they only sowed the seeds of their own regret, a poetic irony that brings a quiet, enduring smile every time I step into my flourishing sanctuary. By the time the following spring rolled around, my garden had transformed from a personal sanctuary into a statement of unassailable triumph. Not just because of its vibrant foliage, towering sunflowers, and the labyrinth of vegetables or herbs, and flowers meticulously arranged to create both beauty and functionality, but because every leaf, petal, and fruit now carried the story of a battle fought with patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve against an HOA that had underestimated the determination, ingenuity, and resourcefulness of a single homeowner, unwilling to bow to petty authority. And as the days grew warmer, I began to implement the final phase of my plan, which was not merely defensive, but designed to cement a legacy that the HOA would regret challenging me for years to come. Beginning with a public garden declaration that highlighted not only the ecological value of my landscaping supporting pollinators, conserving water, promoting native plant species, but also underscored the educational and communal benefits it brought to the neighborhood, inviting local schools, environmental clubs, and media outlets to observe, photograph, and document the garden as a model of sustainable urban landscaping. The response was overwhelming. Articles appeared in community newsletters. Local television ran segments praising the garden's innovation and ecological contributions. And the social media posts shared by attendees went viral within local networks. All while I quietly prepared for the inevitable HOA backlash, which, though diminished, was not completely gone. And I knew they would look for any excuse to reclaim control or save face, so I meticulously double-checked every regulation, every permit, and every protective clause, ensuring that no letter, inspection, or complaint could legally touch me without exposing the board to liability. And as the HOA attempted to convene emergency meetings to discuss next steps, I attended with printed binders full of documentation, photographs, affidavits from neighbors and experts, and even city ordinances that explicitly supported my right to maintain, expand, and improve my garden as I saw fit, and watching their faces. A mixture of incredulity, frustration, and suppressed panic, I realized that the momentum had shifted, irreversibly. Because what they once thought was a simple case of issuing fines and intimidation had become a public relations nightmare, and each attempt they made to send threatening notices or pressure me through indirect channels was met with calm, well-prepared, and legally airtight responses, accompanied by polite but firm communication reminding them of their obligations, limitations, and the potential consequences of overreach. And as the months progressed, my garden became a local landmark, a symbol of resistance against arbitrary power. And neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak now openly praised the yard, participated in planting days, and even reported any suspicious or unauthorized inspections, which further limited the HOA's capacity to interfere, because they knew any overt action would be witnessed, documented, and amplified, undermining their authority and credibility, and with community support solidified. I took a bold step by proposing a formal neighborhood garden initiative, presenting it at the next HOA meeting with detailed plans for workshops, sustainability education, and public engagement, all framed in a way that made the HOA look cooperative and forward-thinking if they endorsed it, and utterly incompetent if they opposed it, and the outcome was precisely what I had anticipated: a divided board, hesitant to act, confronted with a community and media-backed initiative that painted them as obstructionists if they tried to interfere. And suddenly, Carol and her allies were forced into an uncomfortable position, balancing petty pride against public perception, and the contrast between my flourishing garden and their attempts at control could not have been starker. Because while they clung to rules, deadlines, and fines, I had nurtured life, beauty, education, and community, creating a tangible, undeniable proof of value that could not be fined away. And as the weeks went on, I began documenting the results, publishing a series of articles and photo essays that chronicled not only the ecological and aesthetic success of the garden, but also the process of overcoming harassment, which further cemented my position and created a historical record of the HOA's overreach. And when a few board members tried to challenge my claims in writing, I responded with precise counter-evidence, citations, and testimonies that left them no room to maneuver, forcing them to concede quietly, often without public acknowledgement, which was exactly the outcome I desired, because the satisfaction came not from confrontation, but from victory through skill, foresight, and resilience. And I didn't stop at mere legal or procedural triumphs. I transformed the garden into a fully interactive experience, adding educational signage, pollinator hotels, composting demonstrations, and native plant showcases which drew visitors from neighboring communities and even local government representatives, each visit reinforcing the narrative that my garden was a community asset. And every public acknowledgement further diminished the board's authority, while boosting my credibility. And as the seasons changed, the garden matured into a multi-layered ecosystem, from ground covers to towering trellises with edible plants, thriving alongside flowers that attracted bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. And the subtle artistry in the layout, the symmetry and diversity, became almost a metaphor for the balance I had restored in the neighborhood's dynamics, life thriving where rules had sought to stifle it, creativity flourishing where bureaucracy had threatened to impose uniformity, and community engagement blossoming where fear had once silenced voices. And the ultimate poetic justice came when Carol, in a rare attempt to regain control, issued yet another letter claiming that certain plants were unauthorized structures, which I countered with a perfectly documented report detailing their ecological benefits, city ordinances permitting such landscaping, and photographic evidence of long-standing precedent. And when she realized that any further escalation could result in legal and public embarrassment, she quietly withdrew, and the board ceased harassment altogether, effectively admitting defeat without a single word spoken. And from that moment on, my garden became not just a personal triumph, but a public symbol of how intelligence, creativity, persistence, and community support could triumph over petty authority, transforming what began as a potential nightmare into a story of empowerment and victory. And as I walk among the sunflowers swaying gently in the breeze, harvest ripe tomatoes and fragrant herbs, watch bees pollinate every bloom, and listen to neighbors and friends marvel at the beauty, utility, and ingenuity of what once was threatened with destruction, I realized that the true victory was not just in preserving plants, but in proving that patience, strategy, and steadfast belief in one's rights and values could dismantle intimidation, subvert arrogance, and cultivate triumph from soil that the HOA had tried to claim for themselves. And in this realization, every droplet of water on a leaf, every fluttering butterfly, every smile from a neighbor or visitor becomes a testament to resilience, a living record that even the smallest acts of defiance, when carefully planned and courageously executed, can grow into monumental victories, and the HOA, once confident in their power, are now a quiet footnote in a story where life, beauty, and community have won, leaving me with a garden that is not only thriving but immortalized in memory, documentation, and the hearts of those who witness the transformation. A garden that whispers the story of triumph to anyone who walks its paths. A garden that stands as proof that threats can be deflected. Authority can be challenged. The most determined and creative of individuals can turn intimidation into an enduring, flourishing legacy. Months after the HOA had quietly retreated, leaving my garden untouched and my authority as a homeowner solidified, life settled into a rhythm that was both peaceful and charged with the quiet satisfaction of hard-won victory. And yet, even in this apparent calm, the story of my garden had begun to take on a life of its own, reaching beyond my own property and neighborhood as friends. Visitors and curious onlookers documented every corner of my thriving landscape, photographing the towering sunflowers that seemed to touch the sky, the carefully pruned trellises laden with beans and vines, the rainbow of flowers meticulously arranged to attract pollinators, and the small signs I had installed explaining the ecological purpose of every plant, from milkweed supporting monarch butterflies to native wildflowers that nourished bees. And the result was a slow but unmistakable shift in perception among not just neighbors, but local officials, journalists, and gardening enthusiasts, who began to refer to my yard as a model of sustainable urban landscaping, a testament to resilience and ingenuity. And as the weeks passed, the ripple effects became tangible. A nearby school requested to use my garden for a class on ecology. The local gardening club asked me to give a demonstration on pollinator-friendly planting. Even city representatives mentioned my yard in a newsletter, highlighting best practices for private gardens that contribute positively to the community. And while this recognition was gratifying, it also brought new challenges and opportunities, because suddenly, my garden was no longer just my personal triumph. It had become a symbol, a stage upon which the drama of homeowner rights, sustainability, and community engagement played out. And with that symbolism came visitors who were fascinated, inspired, or even envious, all of whom I welcomed with open arms, showing them the composting systems, the rainwater collection barrels, the vertical gardening sections, the intricate patterns I had created to maximize both aesthetics and utility. And in the midst of teaching, demonstrating, and guiding visitors through my living masterpiece, I began to notice subtle signs that the HOA, though outwardly silent, was still aware of my influence, because I would occasionally receive polite but pointed inquiries about whether certain parts of the garden had been permitted, or questions about whether educational activities were commercial use, which, while intended to intimidate, only gave me more material to showcase how thoroughly I had researched and complied with all regulations, citing permits, ordinances, and historical precedents in meticulous detail, turning their veiled threats into evidence of my preparedness. And as I collected every response, every email, and every acknowledgement from city officials and experts, I realized that my dossier of victory was becoming not just a tool for defense, but a record of triumph, one that could withstand scrutiny, legal or social, for years to come. And yet, even with this growing prestige, I felt a desire to expand, to elevate my garden into a full-scale example of what a private homeowner could accomplish with vision, dedication, and strategic intelligence. So I began designing a series of garden extensions that included a small meditation area surrounded by lavender and chamomile, a children's learning plot where they could plant, water, and observe growth, and a demonstration corner for native wildlife support, complete with small ponds for frogs and shelters for birds, and every new addition was carefully documented, with photographs, schematics, and expert commentary, ensuring that each enhancement was legally protected, ecologically sound, and aesthetically harmonious, which made the garden an evolving narrative, a living testament to creativity and resistance. And as word of these expansions spread, the local community became increasingly involved, offering volunteer hours, donations of plants and materials, and even expert consultations, transforming What began as a solo endeavor into a collaborative project that strengthened bonds, fostered learning, and reinforced my position as a respected figure in the neighborhood. And throughout all of this, I remained vigilant, because I knew that success and recognition could provoke jealousy, scrutiny, or renewed attempts at control. And indeed, one morning I noticed a subtle shift in the behavior of certain HOA members, who would linger near the edge of the property during events, whispering into their phones, glancing at my garden with expressions that mixed admiration and frustration. And while I could have felt threatened, I instead took it as confirmation that my strategy had worked. The very same people who had once threatened destruction were now powerless observers of a triumph they could neither dispute nor undermine, and in response, I doubled down on my engagement with the community, hosting themed garden tours, pollinator awareness workshops, and small-scale garden tour table cooking demonstrations, all designed to further cement the idea that my property was not a liability, but an asset, a microcosm of what thoughtful, committed individuals could achieve when given autonomy and support. And through these efforts, I began chronicling the story of the garden itself, not just its plants, but the social, legal, and personal journey that had led to its survival, producing detailed written accounts, photographic essays, and video logs that captured the evolution of each section. From the early days of threat and intimidation to the current state of flourishing life, and these records served multiple purposes: educational, inspirational, and defensive, because they provided clear evidence of legality, community benefit, and ecological contribution. And as the garden continued to thrive, it began attracting attention from neighboring towns and even regional media outlets, who wanted to highlight it as an example of resilience, sustainability, and community engagement, which in turn brought even more visitors, more volunteer efforts, and more validation of the choices I had made. And yet, the most satisfying aspect of all was seeing the subtle but profound change in the neighborhood's culture. Because where once there had been fear of HOA enforcement, there was now a sense of empowerment, a recognition that residents could assert their rights, collaborate, and cultivate beauty without succumbing to arbitrary authority. And each time I walked through the garden, tending to plants, interacting with visitors, or simply enjoying the fruits of my labor, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, because the garden had become more than just soil, seeds, and flowers. It was a living, breathing testament to persistence, intelligence, and community, a symbol that threats and intimidation could be transformed into opportunity and triumph. And as seasons changed, my garden continued to evolve, incorporating native perennials, vertical garden structures, pollinator habitats, and educational signage, all while maintaining aesthetic cohesion and ecological purpose. And throughout, I carefully monitored any lingering HOA activity, documenting inquiries, ensuring compliance, and subtly demonstrating to anyone watching that any attempt to undermine the garden would be met with documented evidence, public support, and undeniable legality, effectively neutralizing potential threats before they could materialize. And as the years went by, the garden's reputation only grew, becoming a case study in local governance newsletters, a model for urban and suburban sustainable landscaping programs, and a source of pride for neighbors who had once been intimidated, inspiring them to take creative ownership of their own yards and public spaces. And through all of this, I maintained my personal connection to the garden, nurturing it with the same love, attention, and care that had defined its earliest days. From planting seeds and pruning vines to harvesting produce and observing the intricate dance of pollinators, birds, and wildlife. And in doing so, I realized that my journey was about more than winning a battle against a petty HOA. It was about creating a legacy, demonstrating the power of persistence, intellect, and strategy, and cultivating life, knowledge, and joy in a space that once faced destruction but now stood as a monument to what can be achieved when one refuses to surrender. And in that realization, I found a deeper satisfaction than any legal victory could provide, because my garden had become an enduring symbol of triumph, community, and resilience, proof that when creativity, preparation, and perseverance meet, courage, Even the most intimidating forces can be transformed into catalysts for growth. And as I stood amidst towering sunflowers, flourishing herbs, vibrant vegetables, and a chorus of buzzing bees and chirping birds, I smiled, knowing that every threat, every letter, every attempt at intimidation had been transformed into a building block for this living, thriving, unstoppable legacy, a garden that would continue to inspire, educate, and delight for generations to come. A garden that had turned the tables completely. A garden that had made the HOA regret ever thinking they could control it. And as I breathed in the fragrant mix of flowers and soil, I realized that the true victory wasn't just in winning against an overreaching authority, but in creating something of enduring beauty, purpose, and life that no amount of bureaucracy could ever erase. And in that realization, I knew my story, my garden, and my triumph were inseparable, forever intertwined. A living testament to the power of persistence, planning, and the quiet but irresistible force of determination. Years passed, and my garden, once a battleground against a petty and overreaching HOA, had fully matured into a living, breathing testament to perseverance, strategy, and creativity. Its colors shifting with the seasons, from the vibrant yellows of towering sunflowers in summer to the deep, earthy tones of late autumn vegetables and the soft pastels of early spring blossoms. And each plant, trellis, and path told a story, from the first shocking letter that threatened destruction to the countless hours spent researching, documenting, and strategizing, which had ultimately transformed a potential nightmare into a symbol of triumph, not just for me, but for the entire community. And the impact was undeniable. Neighbors who had once quietly feared retaliation now approached me with confidence, sharing ideas for their own gardens, asking questions about sustainable practices, and even volunteering to help with planting days, compost workshops, and pollinator habitat installations. And this collective involvement created a sense of neighborhood, unity that the HOA could never have predicted, because the very people who had once been intimidated had now become advocates, allies, and witnesses to a story of resilience. And the garden itself began attracting attention beyond the street, as local newspapers featured it in articles highlighting sustainable home landscaping. Schools requested field trips for students to learn about pollination, soil health, and native plant ecosystems. And even gardening clubs from neighboring towns asked for demonstrations, effectively turning my backyard into a living classroom and community center, all while maintaining its private charm, because every corner was meticulously designed to balance aesthetics, function, and ecological value, from the raised vegetable beds that produced abundant harvests to the flower beds arranged in patterns that optimized pollinator access, the small educational signs explaining the purpose of each plant, from monarch butterfly milkweed to pollinator-friendly herbs, gave visitors not only knowledge but a sense of engagement, a hands-on opportunity to understand the careful orchestration of nature within a suburban yard. And while all this public recognition grew, I maintained careful vigilance, because I knew that any resurgence of HOA meddling could threaten the delicate balance. And so I documented every improvement, every interaction, every visit with photographs, videos, notes, and formal correspondence, creating an unassailable record that served as both a personal journal and legal safeguard. And the subtle but persistent presence of this documentation acted as a shield, ensuring that the HOA's authority remained impotent, as any action they attempted could easily be countered with precise, verifiable evidence of compliance and contribution to the neighborhood. And as the garden expanded, I introduced interactive elements that engaged children, adults, and visitors of all ages, from small hands-on planting plots to composting demonstrations, rainwater collection systems, and miniature wildlife shelters, all designed to educate and inspire while reinforcing the legal and ecological integrity of the property. And these enhancements not only deepened community ties, but also subtly highlighted the contrast between my proactive, thoughtful stewardship and the board's previous attempts at control, which now seemed increasingly petty and short-sighted, in the face of undeniable community benefit. And this contrast became even more striking when media outlets began to feature stories about the HOA's failed attempts to enforce arbitrary rules, framing the narrative as a triumph of citizen initiative, careful planning, and ecological mindfulness over bureaucratic overreach. And through this lens, my garden became more than a personal victory. It became a symbol, a case study, and an inspiration, demonstrating how knowledge, creativity, and persistence could overcome intimidation. And while the board occasionally whispered complaints or circulated internal memos questioning my activities, these attempts were impotent in the face of documented evidence, public support, and ongoing positive engagement. And as the garden flourished, I took deliberate steps to ensure its sustainability, introducing perennial plants, crop rotation practices, organic fertilizers, companion planting strategies that not only maintained high yields and aesthetics, but also strengthened ecological resilience, ensuring that the garden would thrive for years to come, regardless of outside interference. And the success of this long-term approach was evident in the diversity and vibrancy of plant and insect life, the robust growth of vegetables and flowers, and the overall harmony and productivity of the ecosystem, which attracted not only visitors, but also local experts and educators who marveled at the integration of beauty, education, and sustainability. And in this thriving ecosystem, I found both peace and purpose. Because the garden was no longer merely a battleground, but a canvas, a classroom, a sanctuary, and a symbol of what could be achieved through intelligence, foresight, and dedication. And as I walked along the stone pathways bordered by marigolds, tomatoes, and lavender, I reflected on the journey, recalling the initial shock of the first HOA letter, the frustration and anger that fueled late nights of research, the meticulous documentation of every interaction, the strategic planning of countermeasures, the alliances built with neighbors, experts, and community members, and the creative expansion of the garden into a multifaceted space that combined education, beauty, and ecological stewardship. And all these memories reinforced the depth of the accomplishment, because it was never simply about defying an HOA, but about proving that thoughtful, determined individuals could reclaim agency, cultivate life, and transform adversity into opportunity. And this understanding became even more profound as the garden began to inspire others beyond my immediate community, with nearby homeowners initiating pollinator gardens of their own, local schools integrating garden-based learning into their curricula, and regional gardening groups using my property as an example in workshops and seminars, all of which amplified the story of persistence, intelligence, and strategic action. And even as new challenges emerged, whether fluctuations, pests, seasonal adjustments, the garden itself had become resilient, adaptive, and self-sustaining, mirroring the approach I had taken with the HOA battle, always planning several steps ahead, always documenting, always building support and knowledge. And in this sense, the garden and the homeowner had evolved together, both shaped by experience, creativity, and determination. And as the seasons cycled, the garden's symbolism deepened, representing not just survival, but flourishing. It's not just defense, but proactive growth. It's not just resistance, but celebration of what could be achieved when passion, strategy, and community aligned. And the HOA, now largely silent, became a background presence, a reminder of past challenges, but no longer a threat, as the story had shifted decisively with the narrative framed by achievement, education, and community enrichment. And in every harvest, every blooming flower, every bee pollinating a blossom, every child learning in the educational plot, every neighbor inspired to nurture their own corner of the world, the triumph of perseverance and ingenuity was evident, a living, dynamic testament that could not be erased or undermined. And as I surveyed the fully matured garden from the vantage point of the stone patio, basking in sunlight filtering through tall sunflowers and watching the gentle rustle of leaves and wings, I felt a profound satisfaction because the battle that had begun with letters, fines, and threats had culminated in a legacy far greater than mere victory. It had produced life, learning, beauty, and an enduring example of empowerment, strategy, and resilience in this legacy. Documented meticulously, shared generously, and nurtured continuously, ensured that the story of my garden, my triumph over the HOA, and the power of determination would persist for years to come, inspiring, teaching, and reminding all who encountered it that even the smallest acts of courage, when combined with knowledge, planning, and community, can grow into something monumental, unstoppable, and beautiful.